Did you see the face, or?
No, it was profile to me, so
Yeah.
no face detail at all. It took 4 steps, hit the fence line on the other side of the road, and disappeared. That was it.
It was unlike anything Officer Rich had ever seen before. In the grainy thermal footage, the outline was unmistakably human, yet something about it defied explanation. The shape radiated immense heat, pulsing in the camera's view with an intensity no ordinary animal could produce. Those watching the footage could barely believe what they were seeing. A towering figure stood motionless on a ridge, its body outlined in a reddish glow against the cooler blues of the surrounding landscape. For several moments, it didn't move at all, as though it were silently surveying the valley below. Perhaps it was searching for prey, maybe, but the stillness was what made it so unnerving. It simply stood there, like a sentinel watching the dark. Bigfoot had finally been captured on a thermal camera, but as shocking as that footage was, the story behind it would leave an even deeper mark. The encounter that inspired it all came from a man named Rich, a veteran of both the military and law enforcement. His background in survival, observation, and tactical awareness made him an expert witness in any field situation. But what he experienced that night went far beyond the limits of ordinary experience. When researcher Bryce Johnson sat down with Officer Rich to hear his story, nearly 20 years had already passed since the night that changed everything. Yet the memory remained vivid, as if etched into his mind with fire. The encounter haunted him, following him through the years like an echo that refused to fade.
At first, it's shock and fear and frightened, you know. I didn't know what I was dealing with. So I know it's a Sasquatch, but there's more to it than meets the eye, even when you see it.
Bryce could sense from the moment they began that this was not going to be a routine story about a strange noise in the woods. It was something far more intense, something that had altered the course of a man's life. The night that changed everything. The story took place in July of 2000, one of those warm summer nights when the air carries a heavy stillness and the countryside feels almost abandoned. Rich was on duty, driving his patrol car along a narrow 2-lane road that wound endlessly through remote farmland and patches of thick forest. The shift was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound stand out. He could hear the distant call of an owl, the rustle of something small moving through dry grass, and the soft hum of his engine cutting through the night air. Then, out of nowhere, something stepped onto the road. At first, it looked like a shadow, a vague outline at the edge of his headlights. But as it moved into full view, Rich slammed the brakes. The car came to a halt roughly 50 yards from the figure now standing squarely on the asphalt. It was massive, far beyond human proportions. Even from a distance, he could see the sheer width of its chest, the thick build of its shoulders, and the way its entire frame seemed to pulse with muscle beneath a coat of dark hair. For a moment, the night itself seemed to hold its breath. The figure stood there, illuminated only by the glow of the headlights, towering nearly 8 feet tall and weighing somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pounds.
I mean, the chest was massive. The thickness of it, it was covered in hair. 8 feet tall, around 800 to 1,000 pounds, and it was terrifying.
Rich felt a deep, primal chill run down his spine, the kind that bypasses reason and goes straight to instinct. Whatever it was, it radiated power. Every part of its stance suggested strength and self-assuredness, the kind that came from existing in an environment where it had no natural predators. And yet, despite its overwhelming presence, it didn't behave like a threat. It never once turned to face him directly. It remained in profile, moving with slow, deliberate strides, in 4 long steps, each one impossibly smooth for something that size. It crossed the road, reached the fence line on the other side, and disappeared into the darkness beyond. There was no roar, no charge, no attempt to engage, just an eerie silence and the faint rustle of movement fading into the trees. The entire encounter lasted only a few seconds, but to Rich, it felt suspended in time. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and for a moment he wondered if his mind had played tricks on him. But the clarity of what he had seen, the details of its size, movement, and posture, left no room for confusion. This wasn't a man in a suit or a large animal on its hind legs. It was something else entirely. When the moment ended, all he was left with was the hum of his idling car and a pounding heartbeat that refused to slow. The aftermath and the questions. Back in 2000, patrol cars weren't yet equipped with dashboard cameras or night vision systems, and smartphones were still years away. That meant no footage, no photo, no way to prove what he had seen. The only record that existed was his memory, vivid, unshakable, and terrifyingly real. In the days that followed, Rich struggled to process the experience. Every rational explanation failed to fit. He had been trained to observe, identify threats, and read his environment. But this was unlike anything his training could have prepared him for. He knew what bears, elk, and even people looked like in the dark. This was none of those. The realization that he might have come face to face with a Sasquatch, something that shouldn't exist, lodged itself deep in his mind. The psychological toll was immediate. He found himself gripped by an unfamiliar unease. The roads he used to patrol without fear suddenly felt menacing. The woods he once admired for their peace now carried a sense of hidden danger. Even the wind through the trees sounded different, like whispers he couldn't quite interpret. For years he avoided traveling alone. When duty required him to pass through, his hand stayed close to his flashlight, his senses on high alert. The fear wasn't just about what he'd seen, it was about what it meant. If such a creature existed, what else could be out there, hidden from sight, living parallel to humanity in silence? Over time, that fear transformed into something deeper, a sense of respect, even awe. He came to understand that if this being had wanted to harm him, it could have done so easily. Its size and power were unmatched. That knowledge humbled him, serving as a chilling reminder of human vulnerability in the face of the unknown forces that share this planet. Despite the lingering dread, Rich handled the aftermath with the professionalism his job demanded. He wrote up a detailed memo for the sheriff's office, documenting everything he remembered. He categorized the encounter as an unknown phenomenon, ensuring it was officially recorded and stored in case similar reports surfaced. He didn't know whether that memo went any higher up the chain of command or was quietly filed away and forgotten. But for him, it was enough to know that it existed, that the event had been taken seriously and preserved in an official record. Patterns in the wilderness. Most people might have tried to forget an encounter like that, but Rich couldn't. Instead, he turned his unease into investigation. He began researching, combing through reports of similar sightings, and examining every case with the same methodical attention to detail he used in his police work. He wanted to know whether what he had seen was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. The deeper he dug, the clearer the answer became. This wasn't a one-time event. Sightings like his had been reported across multiple states, often in similar terrain and at similar times. People described enormous, hairy, upright creatures appearing suddenly and vanishing just as quickly. And when he started mapping the data, something remarkable stood out. Many of these encounters occurred near major drainages. In these low-lying natural paths, water flows from mountains into valleys. These drainages, he realized, acted as natural travel routes. They were easier to navigate than dense forest or rocky inclines, allowing large creatures to move silently across vast distances. To Rich, it seemed entirely possible that Bigfoot had been using these ancient routes for centuries, traveling from region to region undetected. As he continued his research, he found that some areas, such as Mason County, had unusually high numbers of sightings. The consistency of these reports suggested more than just repeated appearances of the same individual. Instead, it pointed to multiple creatures, each seemingly occupying its own territory, but moving within a structured network of trails. What fascinated him even more was the evidence of social behavior. As he compared tracks and analyzed field reports, a new pattern began to emerge. Many sightings described more than one creature moving together. Footprints of different sizes, large, medium, and small, were often found in the same area, suggesting family groups rather than solitary wanderers. In Kentucky, for instance, investigators had recorded howls echoing from several directions at once. In another case, a smaller footprint had been discovered within the impression of a much larger one, a sign that a younger creature had literally stepped in its parent's path. These small but consistent clues revealed something profound. Bigfoot might live in small family units, much like primates or humans. That realization reshaped the way Rich viewed his own encounter. If the creature he saw was part of a family, then others might have been nearby, hidden just beyond the reach of his headlights that night. The thought both thrilled and unsettled him. He also realized that this understanding could change how investigators approached future research. Juvenile Bigfoot prints, being smaller, could easily be mistaken for those of humans or medium-sized animals. To avoid such errors, investigators would need to expand their field of observation, examining not just clear footprints, but also subtle signs, the bent grass along trails, the slight depression in the soil, or disturbances in the foliage that marked quiet movement through the wilderness. Over the years, Rich's perspective on that night evolved. What had begun as terror turned into curiosity and then into a lifelong investigation. He no longer viewed his encounter as an accident. It was, in his eyes, an invitation to look deeper, to consider that humanity might not be as alone as it believes. The creature he saw was not a myth or an illusion. It was something tangible, something ancient, something that had walked those woods long before human patrol cars and flashlights ever arrived. And though it vanished as quickly as it appeared, the impression it left on him, that deep sense of mystery, power, and humility, would last forever. A heat in the darkness. Night had fully claimed the valley when Russell and his team began their watch. The air was crisp and still, the kind of silence that carried weight, as though the forest itself were listening. From their position nearly 1,000 feet above a narrow water source, they had a clear view of the terrain below. The slope fell away into a thick blanket of trees, and somewhere in that darkness, something could be moving. Every sound carried meaning. Even the rhythm of the wind through the leaves seemed amplified in the stillness. The investigators knew that in this kind of silence, one wrong step could ruin everything. Russell stood motionless at the ridge's edge, the cool metal of the thermal camera pressed to his hands. Below him, a small river cut through the valley, reflecting the faintest shimmer of starlight. It was the perfect vantage point, elevated, remote, and surrounded by unbroken wilderness. If a creature were to move through this valley tonight, he would see it. The thermal camera, humming softly, scanned the landscape in slow, deliberate arcs. On the display, the forest transformed into a mosaic of color. Cold surfaces glowed in deep shades of blue and violet, while warmer objects burned orange and red. It was common for thermal cameras to pick up residual heat like that, an illusion of movement when there was none. But Russell wasn't looking for rocks. He was looking for life. He had learned to distinguish the subtle differences, how the contours of a living being moved differently from those of static terrain, how heat distributed itself across a body, fading around the limbs, pulsing at the core. He'd spent countless nights scanning hillsides like this, separating false positives from real anomalies. Then it happened. Across the valley on the far slope, a faint glow caught his eye. At first, it seemed like just another patch of heated rock, but then it shifted. The movement was slight, a slow, deliberate turn, but enough to snap his full attention to the display. He steadied the camera on its tripod, adjusting the focus until the image sharpened. What he saw next made his chest tighten. A shape stood upright in the distance, tall, broad. The thermal signature burned deep red, alive, warm, unmistakably animate. It wasn't shaped like an animal on all fours. It wasn't a bear. Its shoulders were squared, its torso elongated, its stance unnervingly human. Yet there was something undeniably different about it. The figure remained perfectly still, almost statue-like, staring out across the valley. It didn't sway or shift weight like a person might after standing for too long. Instead, it held its ground with the kind of poise that suggested it was not unaware of being watched, or perhaps that it didn't care. Russell could feel his pulse quicken. For a moment, he wondered if it might be another researcher or a hiker, but the location was far too isolated. No light, no gear, no movement that hinted at human activity, just this lone figure radiating an immense, steady heat. When morning came, Russell shared the footage with Bryce, another member of the team. The two reviewed it carefully, their eyes fixed on the glowing form that was on the screen. Bryce couldn't find any logical explanation either. The image wasn't distorted by terrain or trick lighting. It was standing upright, massive, radiating warmth in a pattern that mirrored living flesh. Down the slope, roughly 1.5 miles from the spot where the figure had appeared, they discovered a dense patch of huckleberry bushes in full bloom. The location wasn't random. If Bigfoot truly existed, it made sense that it would be drawn here too. Signs in the wilderness. As Russell moved through the area, the signs became stranger. Leaves bent in odd angles, branches pressed downward in places where something large might have brushed through. The impressions weren't consistent with deer, which usually left sharper, uneven marks, nor did they match bears, whose fur typically left sweeping patterns like strokes from a brush. These marks were smoother, as if left by something with solid skin, not fur. Russell crouched to examine one of the pressed areas. The shape wasn't distinct enough to call it a footprint, but the depth suggested significant weight. Something heavy had been here. They followed the signs to an old logging road overgrown with brush. The road hadn't been used in years. Small saplings and moss now covered what used to be gravel. There were no recent tire tracks, no human footprints. Whatever had passed through had done so quietly and carefully. Russell thought back to the stories he'd heard from tribes and locals. Bigfoot wasn't described as a destructive force, but as a guardian of the wilderness, a presence that moved with purpose, leaving the forest as it was found. The scene before him matched that description perfectly. Signs of passage, yes, but no harm, no chaos. It was as if the creature had moved through with reverence for the land itself. He continued forward, each step deliberate, eyes scanning for any inconsistency. The further he went, the more he noticed how the vegetation bore subtle signs of disturbance, not damage, just contact. Branches had been brushed aside gently, not torn. Leaves were pressed downward in places that didn't align with animal grazing patterns. Whatever had moved through had done so with precision. It wasn't hard to imagine the creature from the night before passing this way. Russell recalled how it had stood so still, as though aware of his distant gaze. It hadn't appeared afraid or curious, more observant, perhaps even cautious. The intelligence in that stillness lingered in his mind. The trail eventually opened into a small clearing bordered by huckleberry bushes. He could see where clusters of berries had been stripped clean, and in a few spots, branches bent low, their stems split as if something large had leaned over them. He knelt to inspect the soil and noticed faint impressions, shallow but broader than a human foot. The spacing between them was irregular, yet they aligned in a way that suggested bipedal movement. It wasn't proof, not by the scientific standard, but it was something. Something that added weight to the mystery. As Russell continued deeper into the forest, the terrain became rougher. Fallen logs crisscrossed the trail, moss-covered and slick from years of decay. The canopy thickened, swallowing much of the daylight, leaving only fractured beams of light that pierced through the mist. The atmosphere grew dense, the kind of quiet that made you feel watched. He stopped often, scanning the surroundings with both his eyes and his equipment. The forest floor was littered with pine needles and twigs, yet in some places, the debris seemed oddly displaced, as though something heavy had stepped there recently. The old stories whispered in his thoughts again. Tales of guardians of the forest, beings who watched over nature but avoided humanity. Whether legend or reality, the behavior described fit what he was observing. Calculated, quiet movement that left no trace of recklessness. Hours slipped away as he tracked the faint indicators down the slope toward the clearing where the heat signature had first appeared. He paused often, noting the angle of broken branches, the compression of moss, even the way certain leaves were turned against the wind's natural direction. Each clue was like a whisper from the unseen, evidence of something that had been there but refused to be caught. By the time Russell reached the lower edge of the clearing, the forest around him had transformed again. The air was cooler, shaded, and silent, except for the distant flow of the river. This was the exact spot where the thermal figure had stood. He walked slowly through the clearing, analyzing every inch of ground. Every sign pointed to intention, not chaos or instinct, just purpose. His mind replayed the thermal image, the tall, unmoving figure bathed in red light. It wasn't random, it wasn't an illusion. The more evidence he gathered, the clearer it became that this creature, whatever it was, navigated the forest with understanding, as though it belonged here in a way humans never could. Russell's thermal footage, paired with the physical indicators, formed one of the most compelling cases the team had encountered. Standing once more on the ridge as dusk began to fall, Russell gazed out over the valley. The forest had returned to silence, the river gleaming faintly below. Somewhere within that endless expanse of trees, something had watched them, and perhaps was watching still. He realized then that the search wasn't about capturing or confronting. It was about understanding. To chase Bigfoot was to chase the very boundary between known and unknown, a reminder that even in a world mapped and measured by science, mystery still breathed in the wild places. And tonight, on that quiet ridge above the valley, the mystery felt very much alive.